Hey guys, Nate and Shannon coming to you from our new studio. This is the first video recorded in here. We'll be changing the background, but we're going to do a two-part series, post-possession and rent back, right? And I guess let's start off with post-possession. And what I've noticed is we're getting a lot of people doing post-possession right now because of the market. This is a very interesting process. People will say, yeah, we'll do a post-possession for 30 days to get the contract accepted. Then we start getting calls into the office like, well, what about earnest money? What about security deposit? What about insurance? What about taxation? So why don't you take us through, Shannon?
Okay.
And tell us everything we need to know to keep us out of trouble.
Well, I think the important thing to know is I'm going to mention a lot of things that you don't necessarily have to know, but you have to know exist. And here's why. We have to advise our clients prior to going into these agreements about the different factors that they may not be considering. We're not always dealing with a savvy investor or who's done any kind of a rental or any kind of they've never owned a VRBO, they've never owned anything like that. So they really don't know what all can come into play in these situations. So something to consider on a post-possession in particular is that it should be used in conjunction with the contract. It should be negotiated with the contract, and we'll get back to that. And it should be used for times when that seller is going to stay in the property less than 30 days after close. 30 days or more is a whole different conversation that we'll talk about when we talk about rent backs and lease backs. That falls under a whole different set of rules and laws in terms of Landlord-Tenant Act and those sort of things. So with a post-possession, it falls into that more of a VRBO type of situation. Nate, you have a VRBO. There's some factors we're going to talk about with that. It falls into those transient lodging rules. So it is very clear that it's 30 days or less for those kind of things. Things to consider are deposits. Like, Nate, do you have deposits when you lease out your short-term rental or your VRBO?
Yes, of course we do. Yeah.
Okay, and do you hold those deposits?
Well, I use a third-party company like Property Manager to do that for me.
Okay, so that's important to know. So why that's important is because sometimes I'm seeing contracts come through and they're just addressing maybe the rental amount or whether that's a per day, per week, per month rate type of a thing. It's prorated depending on the situation. Who's holding that money? When is it being paid? For deposits, are there going to be any? Who's holding them? Will anything be paid through escrow? These are all things just to think in ahead of time, because what we see is are contracts that don't address those, and then you have maybe a buyer who's now going to be quasi landlord or innkeeper, if you will, who now wants those things, but it wasn't negotiated into the contract. So now we have a potential challenge trying to get the parties to have a meeting of the minds at the end or when that agreement actually starts. One thing to note in a post-possession is from a statutorial standpoint and a legal standpoint, our licensing requires us to advise in writing that the clients seek counsel in a couple areas. And thankfully, our purchase contract that I've got here has the language in that. And most, I say most because not all, there's no consistent post-possession agreement among brokers in town because AAR's never created one. But our contract has the language that we are required to give those parties. And what it reads is, broker recommends that the parties seek independent counsel from insurance, legal, tax, and accounting professionals regarding the risks of a pre-possession or post-possession of the premises. If you're going to have those agreements in place, I would highly recommend you have the parties initial just that section and that language, so that if you get an agreement that doesn't include it, you can clearly show that you pointed that out to them and have that in writing and advise them properly.
Shannon, I'd like to jump in here and just talk a little bit. You said one thing that really stands out.
Okay.
AAR has never created a post-possession agreement. There's a reason for that, right?
There is. These agreements fall into a very gray area, if you will, from a legal standpoint. A post-possession versus a lease and a Landlord-Tenant Act have very different laws that apply. You have the difference from a very basic perspective in terms of what if someone doesn't move out? the proceedings and the process for removing someone from a property under a leaseback situation and landlord-tenant is a full eviction process. Proper notice is being served, risk of restitution, potentially court proceedings depending on the situation, lockouts, and then you fall into CDC and the things that are happening in that world right now on a federal level. So not only from a state level, but a federal level. A post-possession, however, could maybe fall more into those innkeeper and transient lodging where it's more of just a trespassing situation and it's a non-judicial process to remove a party from the property.
So basically, when we're doing some type of post-possession or rent back, would you say it's in the best interest to keep it 30 days or under and not get into a lease?
Depending on the perspective, yes.
Okay.
I mean, it always depends on which side you're on, but yes, I think in general, it's probably a little safer from a standpoint of people not understanding the process and the difference from a legal standpoint.
There's so much involved. You can see Shannon is just going, I would say, almost crazy with all the post-possessions, leases, and they're being done incorrectly. I know you're going to share at the end maybe a checklist or maybe the best practices to do with post-possession.
Things to consider. Things like, does the HOA allow rentals or short-term rentals? Is the lender going to approve this? Have you covered in the agreement things like deposits, rates, occupancy rights, pets, damage, alterations to the property, utilities, maintenance, pool, landscaping, that sort of thing. One thing to consider is, have you made it a part of the contract, again, so that the lender is aware right up front? And then, of course, from a licensing perspective, now that it's part of the actual transaction, managing that situation versus in a leaseback, now it's a separate transaction, if you will, and not getting yourself into unintended property management. If you're not authorized to do that, it's a whole different set of rules for that as well. So it's just knowing that these things are out there so that you can advise people properly to go seek the counsel they need on those items. And that's why AAR hasn't created these forms, because there's just so many factors.
Couple things. Repairs. Who's going to be responsible for repairs?
Right.
Who's going to be responsible for holding the deposit? Who's going to be responsible for doing the walkthrough to get the deposit back? Right.
How about the access for the walkthrough?
Right.
Landlord-Tenant Act, now you fall into proper access, the notice for access that you have to provide.
Even without post-possession, one of the challenges that sometimes comes up is the way the current homeowner leaves the house. May not be as clean, so will they keep the deposit? Holes in the walls from all their pictures and personal belongings. The carpet being worn once they remove the beds, and all of a sudden we see a house maybe different than the way we purchased it.
Right.
And when there's a deposit being held, he who holds the money, someone has control.
Right.
Okay. So we just got to make sure. And it's funny how many people say, "Oh, we don't need a deposit. We've been living here. We're not going to ruin the house." But it does. Everything becomes a challenge, and I guess the biggest challenge that I see as an owner of a company and you as the broker is that if something goes wrong, our poor agents get pulled into a legal battle, and the first thing they have to do is write a check for $5,000.
For that insurance deductible.
Yeah, last time I checked, nobody's charging a fee to fill out the post-possession agreement.
Right.
We're taking on a lot of responsibilities. One of the things that Shannon asked me is, do we want to charge the agents an additional E&O fee for these type of things, which we probably should. But I said, no, the agents are working too hard. We're just going to go ahead and go through that and not charge any additional fees. But we're taking on a lot of risk. And one of the things that over the next couple of weeks, we're going to be talking a lot about risk and how to avoid risk.
Right. And keeping in mind when that conversation about the risk management fee came up, it was because when we go over that 30 days and potentially are doing a lease, you're adding it to our broker transaction file, which is fine. But keeping in mind, if you were not if it wasn't part of that contract transaction in a normal lease situation, if you were to list a property for lease, a whole set of separate documents that should apply for risk management purposes, and we're not always getting those in those situations, even though that same risk is still inherent in there. So it's just very important that you understand. I always think about it this way: when we talk about why we prohibit lease options and those sort of things. If you think about, if you've been doing this a while, how many things can go wrong in a 30 to 45 day escrow, Nate?
Mm-hmm.
It can and it will. It's Murphy's Law when we're in real estate. But think about, now you're doubling that in some cases now with that possession time, and things that could go wrong are likely to go wrong, and making sure everybody's prepared for what happens in those situations. It's setting that expectation like anything else.
Shannon, I know we're coming off COVID, thank God.
Mm-hmm.
But you could have somebody that can't move out because they're sick at the end of a possession. Right. Another challenge that, do we have a COVID agreement in place?
Right. And those are the things that is particularly in a 30-day or more lease back situation very much come into play, because now you do have some federal, our state executive order, I believe, expires. It's changed every day, I feel like, but I believe it expires March 31st this month. But you still have right now in place some moratoriums on lockouts and removing a party because of COVID concerns. From a federal level, you have the CDC's situation and order that's in place. Again, things that in the past we haven't had to think about, but complicate normal rentals and property management. Now do this as part of a real estate transaction for just a buy-sell, and you can imagine the challenges that we could see.
So we're coming up on about a 15-minute video here, and it's important that you watch this. Maybe you watch this video a few times. If you were to summarize what documents needed to be included along with the post-possession agreement.
Mm-hmm. So first of all, we talked about with it, the AR has never created an actual form for this. What they have done, however, is created a sample clauses and kind of a template for one. And what I have is, in our working docs of SkySlope, I have two versions of that. I have just the full version that includes every single clause, and I have one that you could modify potentially, because the full version includes things like for a pre-possession or a garage move-in sort of a thing versus a full occupancy, those kind of things. So you can massage that to what's applicable for the situation. But the language in there is very careful to cover things like not using landlord-tenant, using seller-buyer in this case, so that it's very clear we're not falling into that part of things. But those are in SkySlope for you. We're also going to be having a checklist of things that are just talking points for you to talk to your client about and to consider in these situations if they're not aware.
I think we're also going to create a video, maybe the pitfalls or things that, I don't know who use that terminology, but we want to create something that might be easy enough for you to have your seller and or your buyer. Will create one for each that maybe can be just sent out to them as kind of a disclosure notice of what they're getting themselves into.
And in the end, it's just important we remember we're not attorneys, we're not tax folks, we're not insurance people. We need to advise our clients to actually seek that counsel because of all these factors that can come into play.
Excellent. Well, thank you. I think we've covered just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to
that's the truth.
And we'll create some additional videos on this topic as we go. Thank you guys so much for listening, and we appreciate you. Look forward to part 2, and that is the lease after the close of escrow.
Thanks,
have a great
guys.
day.
Have a great week.